He watched, he planned, and then he shattered a quiet college town. What drives a mind to such unthinkable depths? The case of Bryan Kohberger isn't just a grim headline. It's a chilling puzzle for anyone fascinated by the darkest corners of human behavior. Today, we're not just recounting facts. We're diving deep into the emerging profile of a man accused of unthinkable acts, exploring the psychological theories that might help us understand the why behind the what. What makes a criminology student, supposedly studying the very nature of crime, allegedly commit one of the most brutal mass murders in recent memory? Stick around, because the answers, or at least the questions they provoke, are truly unsettling. To understand the crime, we have to understand the man at the center of it all. Brian Koberger is a puzzle, a guy whose life looks completely different, depending on which angle you're looking from. Brian Christopher Koberger was born in 1994 and grew up in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. Nothing about his early life really screams future killer. He had 2 sisters, and after high school, he kind of drifted for a bit. He tried a technical school, dropped out, but then found his footing in academia. He got a degree in psychology, then a master's in criminal justice. Finally, in the fall of 2022, he moved all the way across the country to Pullman, Washington, to start his PhD in criminology. And that's where things get really weird, because his new university was less than 8 miles from the house where 4 students would soon be murdered. Now, here's the paradox of Brian Kohberger. In the classroom, he was a star. One of his old professors called him a brilliant student and said he was one of only 2 students she'd ever recommended for a PhD program. But outside of that academic world, he was a completely different person. People who knew him socially used words like creepy, odd, and weird. They talked about his intense stare and how he had this strange macho attitude that just put people off. Back in Pennsylvania, he apparently made women so uncomfortable at a local brewery that the owner had to have a talk with him. This wasn't just a one-time thing. This pattern of social failure followed him to Washington. At his new university, other grad students said he was argumentative, especially with women. There was even an incident where he was accused of mansplaining so badly that a female student just got up and left the room. It got so bad that just 2 weeks before the murders, the faculty had to sit him down to talk about all the complaints they were getting about his behavior. He was even fired from his teaching assistant job that December. You see this split, right? On one hand, you have this brilliant mind who studies crime and psychology. He probably felt like he was smarter than everyone else, that he deserved respect and admiration. But in the real world, people kept rejecting him. So he could always retreat back into his books, back into this theoretical world where he was the expert, the one who understood how criminals think. You can just imagine this anger, this narcissistic rage, bubbling under the surface. The smart guy who couldn't get anyone to like him. And his academic interests? They weren't just general. They were laser-focused on the mind of the criminal. He studied under a famous forensic psychologist, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who knows everything there is to know about serial killers. She even co-wrote the autobiography of the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. At his new school, his research was all about why offenders make the choices they do. He even posted a survey on Reddit for ex-convicts. He asked them to describe everything they were thinking and feeling, from the start to the end of their crimes. He said he wanted to understand how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. Looking back, it's not just creepy. It feels like he wasn't just studying criminals. He wanted to know what it felt like to be one. The night of November 12, 2022, started like any other weekend for the students at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho. Ethan Chapin and Shauna Kernadel were at a fraternity party. Madison Moggan and Kaylee Goncalves were out at a downtown sports bar called the Corner Club. By about 2 a.m. on November 13th, everyone was back home. But as they were settling in for the night, Brian Koberger was on the move. We know this because at 2:47 a.m., his cell phone suddenly went dark. It just stopped reporting to the network, which is exactly what happens when you turn it off or put it in airplane mode to hide where you are. Investigators believe the murders happened in a terrifyingly short window of time, just 25 minutes, Between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., we know that Shauna was likely awake. She got a DoorDash delivery at around 4 a.m. and she was on TikTok on her phone at 4:12 a.m. This is where the story gets really chilling. One of the two surviving roommates, identified in court documents as DM, was woken up by noises. At first, she thought it was just Kayleigh playing with her dog. But then she heard what sounded like crying from Xana's room, and then a man's voice saying something like, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Around 4:17 a.m., a security camera at a neighbor's house picked up some muffled sounds, whimpering, a loud thud, and then a dog barking over and over again. DM opened her bedroom door and saw a man. He was dressed all in black, with a mask covering his mouth and nose. She described him as tall, athletic, with bushy eyebrows. She said she just stood there, frozen in shock, as he walked right past her and out the back door. Just 3 minutes later, at 4:20 a.m., a white sedan, which police later identified as Kohberger's Hyundai Elantra, was caught on video speeding away from the area. At 4:48 a.m., Kohberger's phone magically turned back on, and by 5:25 a.m., his car was spotted back on his university campus. The horror inside that house went undiscovered for hours. It wasn't until almost noon that a 911 call was finally made, reporting an unconscious person. When police arrived, they found the 4 victims dead on the 2nd and 3rd floors. The investigation that followed was a massive undertaking, but it was helped along by some really big mistakes made by the killer. The single most important piece of evidence was something the killer left behind: a tan leather knife sheath. It was found on the bed right next to Madison Maugan and Kayleigh Goncalves. On the button snap of that sheath, forensics experts found a tiny amount of DNA. It was from one single male. This was the golden ticket. Once investigators started looking at Kohberger, they needed to match that DNA. So, on December 27th, they secretly collected trash from his family's home back in Pennsylvania. The DNA from that trash showed that the DNA, the sheath, almost certainly belonged to the son of the man whose trash they'd collected. After his arrest, they took a direct DNA sample from Kohberger, and it was a perfect match. Game over. For weeks, the police had been asking the public for help finding a specific car, a white Hyundai Elantra, model year between 2011 and 2016. They had seen it on security footage, circling the King Road house before the murders, and then peeling out of there afterward. When they ran a search of cars registered at Washington State University, bingo! Brian Koberger owned a 2015 white Hyundai Elantra. Suddenly, he wasn't just some random guy. He was their #1 suspect. The digital trail was just as damning. When investigators pulled Kohberger's historical cell phone records, they found something shocking. His phone had pinged off cell towers near the victim's home at least 12 different times in the months leading up to the murders. And almost every time, it was late at night or in the very early morning hours. On the night of the murders, that 2-hour window where his phone was turned off from 2:47 a.m. to 4:48 a.m. was the most suspicious thing of all. It was a clear attempt to hide his location, but that attempt itself became a huge piece of evidence against him. Here's the crazy part. For a guy studying to be an expert in criminology, Kohberger made some rookie mistakes. He had actually written papers about how to commit crimes without getting caught, talking about wearing gloves and special suits to avoid leaving DNA. But what did he do? He left the one thing with his DNA all over it right at the scene. That knife sheath was a catastrophic mistake. Driving his own car back and forth past the house, creating a video record of his stalking? Another huge error. And using his cell phone in a pattern that basically drew a map of his obsession? It's like he knew all the theory, but completely failed the practical exam. On December 30th, 2022, police arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' house. He was extradited back to Idaho, and on June 30th, 2025, he accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. On July 23, 2025, the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without any chance of parole, plus another 10 years for the burglary. During the sentencing, The victims' families gave heartbreaking statements. Koberger just sat there, silent and emotionless. The judge called him a faceless coward and said it was time to end Mr. Koberger's 15 minutes of fame. But the plea deal was tough for some of the families. Madison Moggin's father said he was relieved it was over, but Kaylee Goncalves' family felt cheated. They wanted a trial. They wanted to see him face the ultimate punishment. It just goes to show that even when the legal case is closed, the pain and the search for justice never really end for the people left behind. So we know who did it, how he did it, and that he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. But the one question that still hangs over this entire case is, why? Why would a PhD student in criminology do this? Several theories have popped up. The first major theory is that Koberger developed a one-sided, creepy obsession with one or more of the women. He built this fantasy world through social media and then started crossing over into the real world. The evidence here is pretty strong. There are reports that an Instagram account believed to be his followed Madison, Kaylee, and Shauna. An investigator told reporters that Koberger sent a bunch of direct messages to one of the victims in the weeks before the murders. She never replied. This digital stalking matches up perfectly with his physical stalking. Those 12 late-night trips his cell phone records show him making to their neighborhood. It gets even spookier. Before she died, Kaylee Goncalves had told her friends she thought she had a stalker. She saw a man she didn't know just staring at her from a hill behind their house. We can't prove that was Koberger, but it fits the pattern perfectly. This theory suggests that his motive was a desperate, violent attempt to make his digital fantasy a physical reality. A second, and very powerful, theory is that this was an act of incel rage. Incel is short for involuntary celibate, and it's a term for a subculture of men who are frustrated and angry that they can't find romantic or sexual partners. They often blame women for their problems, and that anger can sometimes boil over into violence. This theory is rooted in all those stories about Koberger's awkward and creepy behavior around women. From the bar in Pennsylvania to the classrooms in Washington, his life was a long story of social rejection. Criminal profilers think the crime was likely fueled by a toxic mix of hatred, arousal, and a deep-seated need to have total control over the women he felt had rejected him. Those unanswered Instagram messages could have been the final straw in a lifetime of feeling ignored. Kaylee Goncalves' father also made some disturbing claims. He said investigators told him about Koberger's search history, which was full of searches for drunk passed-out girls and gagging girls. While there was no evidence of sexual assault at the crime scene, that doesn't mean the motive wasn't sexual. This theory paints a picture of the murders not as a crime of passion for one person, but as a cold, hateful explosion of rage against all women. The third big theory, and one the media loved, is that Koberger thought he was so smart he could commit the perfect crime. Armed with all his knowledge from studying criminology, he developed this God complex, believing he could outsmart the police and get away with murder. He certainly knew the theory. He knew about forensics. He knew about DNA. And his actions after the crime, like cleaning his car and apartment so thoroughly that someone said it looked disassembled inside, show he was trying to cover his tracks. He was trying to apply his textbook knowledge to a real-life murder. But this theory falls apart when you look at his mistakes. Leaving that knife sheath? That's not something an expert trying to commit the perfect crime does. It was a massive, unforgivable error. So, while arrogance was definitely a huge part of his personality, the perfect crime theory doesn't really explain why he felt the need to kill in the first place. The existing theories all have pieces of the truth, but none of them feel complete. They talk about his obsession, his rage, his arrogance, but they don't tie it all together with the single most defining thing about him. He was a student of criminology. So, here's a new, more chilling theory. What if Brian Koberger's main motive was a horrifying final project for his studies? What if this was an act of what researchers call participant observation? This wasn't just about committing a crime to prove he was smart. It was about committing the crime to gain a special, ultimate kind of knowledge. He had this narcissistic belief that the only way to truly understand the mind of a killer was to become one. He planned and carried out the murders as his own twisted, dark case study. The goal was to feel, for himself, all the emotions and thoughts that he had only ever read about in books. This theory recasts Koberger. He's not just a killer. He's a researcher who made his own mind the subject of his final, monstrous experiment. His whole academic life was focused on the personal experience of the criminal. That Reddit survey wasn't just a class project, it was practice. The murders were the final step, the moment where the person studying the crime crosses the line and becomes the crime itself. When you look at the evidence through this lens, everything starts to look different. Target selection is case study design. Why them? Maybe it wasn't personal. Maybe they were chosen because they were the perfect type for his study. They were popular, social, living the exact kind of college life he was excluded from. They were the perfect control group to measure his own elation against. That house on Ting Road wasn't just a target. It was his laboratory. Stalking is fieldwork. All those late-night drives and social media stalking weren't just about obsession. It was a dark kind of field research. He was observing his subjects in their natural habitat, collecting data before starting the active phase of his experiment. The brutality and the blunder, the incredible violence of the attack wasn't just rage. It was a necessary part of the experiment. He needed to fully experience the high adrenaline, emotional state of a killer to see what it felt like. And leaving the knife sheath? Maybe it wasn't just a mistake. Maybe, on some subconscious level, this researcher wanted his work to be found. He wanted his case study to be solved, with him, the brilliant criminology student, at the very center of it all. It guaranteed that he would become a permanent part of the true crime world he studied so obsessively. Post-crime behavior as data cleaning. His meticulous cleaning and his weirdly calm behavior in court also fit this theory. He was a researcher finishing his project. He was cleaning his data, closing his notebooks, and then just watching to see what would happen next. In that courtroom, he wasn't the killer anymore. He was back to being the observer, watching the criminal justice system, the very thing he studied, react to what he had done. The case of the Idaho murders is legally closed. 4 bright young lives were cut short, and the killer is behind bars forever. But the story of Brian Koberger will stick with us. A uniquely terrifying story from our modern world. It's a story about what can happen when academic intelligence mixes with deep social failure and a twisted obsession. The search for why doesn't end with simple rejection or a botched perfect crime. It ends with the horrifying idea that for a man who spent his life studying the minds of criminals, the final act of his research was to commit murder. Brian Kohberger's academic journey didn't lead him to understand evil. It led him to become it. In his sick search for knowledge, he turned himself from a student of crime into a permanent and chilling case study of it.